the enemy's just there pounding you with lies and deceit and twisting your thoughts. I have found that the minute you talk about something, it's almost like all of that bound up energy from the devil that tries to take us out falls away. Well, guys, welcome back to the podcast. I'm really excited about this episode. My guest today will really be able to bring a dimension that I haven't been able to speak about, or bring a dimension that none of our guests have had on the podcast to date. Today, we've got Dr. Danny Cheah, who is a Christian. He is a psychiatrist and done some phenomenal work over his career in lots of different groups at the moment, specializing in children and families. He can speak to that in a little bit. But he's got, his Christian faith and his profession kind of collide, and he's got some real handles on psychology, on mindset, on self-management, and we're going to get into those today so that you can become a better entrepreneur, play the long game, make it sustainable so that you can have your greatest impact. Hey, welcome, Dr. Danny. Why don't you tell us who is Danny Cheah?
Hey, Wes. Thanks for having me on your program, and I'm really pleased to be able to contribute a little bit to what you're doing in this ministry, and I'm looking forward to what I can learn from this conversation as well. So I live in Melbourne. I'm from Malaysia originally. I grew up there, lived there for 20 years, and then I moved to Australia about 20 years ago to do university, study, and then work. I currently work, so I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and I work as the head of clinical services at a child and youth mental health service in a city suburb of Melbourne, with one of the large metropolitan hospitals here. We have about 120 staff in a department that I lead together with the operations manager, and we're quite busy in our work at the moment in terms of growing the service, and as well as introducing innovations in the area of child and youth mental health. Also, I attend a local church in Melbourne. I've been pretty connected throughout my journey, growing up in church life, serving in ministry, and I do quite a bit of volunteer through the music ministry. I play keys in a band at churches throughout the different places I've lived in, and it's really helped me to connect with people quite easily, plus doing something that I really enjoy that's very different to what I do at work. Over the last 5 or 6 years, through a series of, I guess, other challenges in my life, and having to frequently travel back to Malaysia to support my parents at that time, I had the opportunity to then start delivering mental health talks through to a number of churches there, in terms of just equipping Christians and Christian leaders to understand a bit about mental health from a Christian perspective, dealing with issues about stigma, do some workshops around equipping families and carers and leaders around what they are potentially doing as church leaders in terms of being sort of a default mental health support for a lot of people in the community. And over it's grown through word of mouth, and I've had opportunities to kind of do that in a number of churches across Melbourne in Australia, one in New York as well. And so, yeah, that's I think how some of this has come about, and I kind of do that in a volunteer capacity while working full time. So yeah, it's trying to juggle all that. But what's been really great is meeting different people along the way. That's helped to shape my perspectives, be able to learn from different people in different walks of life and different industries, and hear the questions that come up and the conversations that come up. That's really helped to inform the way that I work, the way that I provide some of these education sessions to churches. And yeah, so that's kind of a bit of what I do, and where I've come from.
Hey, I'm not sure if you heard, but I've got an event coming up called the Kingdom Business Summit. We've been running these since 2012, all over Australia, been in the US and New Zealand, and there's one coming up real soon. And I invite you to grab your tickets, whether you attend in person in Brisbane, Australia, or on our live stream. It's 2.5 days of the most practical Kingdom business training you could ever imagine. I'll be speaking through how to scale up your business. I've got Olympic medalists. I've got the father of the marketplace movement, Ed Silvoso, dialing in. I've got a couple of local entrepreneurs who have built significant businesses. There's going to be a time of networking and a time of fun. It's going to be a phenomenal, life-changing event. To find out more, just go to kingdombusiness.global, kingdombusiness.global. It's the most preeminent event you could ever go to, the most practical event you could ever go to, and we're going to have a whole bunch of fun. All right, grab your ticket soon. I look forward to seeing you at the event. Let's go back to this episode. I want to jump straight into, I guess, the pressures of today. There'll be people listening who are, running a business. They may have just started their business, or they might be, decades into their business. But I've got a theory around the pressures of today. Like if I get an instant message from somebody who's like, hey, I'm interested in doing some coaching or some marketing with you or something, like, if I don't get back to them in an hour, they've probably gone and found somebody else, right? And that's kind of like all through the day and night now that we're global. We go to bed here, America wakes up, there, and so there's these pressures, and the kids want to go out every night, and one's doing ballet and one's doing soccer, and then you've got to try and hold this marriage together, and possibly both people are working in some cases, and then obviously church, and they're all beautiful things. But I look at the pressures of today, and I have a theory, and I want you to speak into it. I have a theory that the pressures that we deal with today, if they were put in front of somebody 100 years ago, might have even put them in an institution, right? Because of how we're wired. So I guess I'm wondering, like, is it a lot worse? Or actually, did they just have their own pressures 100 years ago that were just as bad? They just look different, right? Have you got any intel on whether it actually is worse, or whether it's just different? Or is it actually just a lot more pressure than it would have been 100 years ago, example?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think every generation throughout the history of mankind have had to contend with a set of different issues. And I think they sort of build on each other as well. So I think it's not necessarily discrete issues that generations have to deal with. And I just think that, in terms of what we're dealing with at the moment is around the online world, connectivity, social media, and all that. And I think that also builds upon a previous generation dealing with industrialization, for example. So it's there is a connection between what previous generations have to to deal with. I think it's really difficult to kind of compare, and then so in some ways it becomes really hard to kind of say that somehow we've got it wrong, or there's a lot of different ways that we can approach, I guess, the way we understand the current situation. And sometimes when we're going, we all generations have to go through something to work through it. And so in that process of working through it, there's a level of uncertainty, there are lots of doubts and questions. And then I think the natural response to doubts and questions is to reference that with something that we know and compare. So we're not quite sure what we're doing. We're still working it out, muddling our way through life, and that's part of life. And then with that level of uncertainty about the future and what the next set of challenges will be in the future, we then kind of refer back to history, or kind of think, oh, well, if we are having these problems because we're not doing it in a similar way that a previous generation might deal with, or making those comparisons. So that's a natural way that we kind of think through problems as well. But I would say that some of this is just sitting with some of the uncertainty and kind of muddling our way through things, but also trusting that human beings have survived all sorts of different challenges throughout each generation, and kind of being able to hold that I guess bigger worldview that helps us to navigate this season, but also trusting God and helping us to work through what this current generation has to contend with. Because what's constant throughout that is God, and being able to stand on His promises, and while the application or the different issues that we have to contend with are different, God's word and His promises are constant throughout history. So I think being able to use that reference point, being able to trust humanity in that sense, and sometimes stepping away from some of the doom gloom interpretation of what's going on in our world today. Because I think that adds a level of anxiety that kind of creates a very negative way of trying to solve problems rather than embracing what we've got and looking at what we can do to make the best out of situations that we're in.
Yeah. So if we just stay right where we are now, we hear these things around, like don't be connected to your phone. It's dangerous. Don't look at it before you go to bed. Like too much. Don't be too connected. Have we got any evidence yet that it is detrimental to our brain? The pressures, I guess, the outworking would be anxiety, panic attacks. I don't know. I guess I don't know. That's why I'm asking the question. But because I love it. I love the fact that I can get a message and within 6 minutes I've written, we've communicated 35 times and come to an answer. Like that speed and that, I'm a big fan of it because it means I can move really quickly. But I guess and then we hear that it's bad and there's the blue light and all it. Do we actually have evidence yet to say that it is very, very detrimental to our brain function, our psychology, our mindset, our mental health, our physical health? Is it proven?
Yeah, there are a number of different situations that we're starting to understand that kind of, I guess, contribute to poorer physical and mental health with regards to the use of technology. I was reading an article recently around the impact of our posture and the way that we look at our phones and the impact on our necks and back and the equivalent amount of kilos that puts on your neck when we sitting or looking at our phones in a particular posture. So obviously prolonged use will have impact on our physical health in that sense. Long periods of exposure to screen time and lights can actually impact on our sleep as well, and not just a number of hours of sleep, but the quality of our sleep. Typically, when we look at screens, because of the light and stimulation, our blink rate actually reduces. So we're not blinking as often because we're kind of staring at a light as opposed to, say, reading a book. And so then that has impact on our eye health and a number of things like that. But also the amount of stimulation that's constant can kind of increase, I guess, what our brain has to do in terms of filtering the noise that comes in from the environment, which our brain does naturally. So I think there's an element of that. Saying that, I guess I'm not a business owner, but I'm imagining there are a lot of pressures and challenges that make it quite difficult to, in spite of knowing some of these things, to then be able to just tune out or turn off your phone, because there are repercussions, there are consequences, which are also equally challenging too. So it's about balancing all those things. I think it's about kind of looking at how do we kind of set structures or routines in our life that help us to manage that, rather than kind of saying, oh, this is good or that's bad, and looking at how do we find a balance and kind of knowing where our limits are. Because as much as we need to achieve certain tasks or do certain things and meet those demands, if we get to a point where we're exhausted and overwhelmed, then our ability to actually perform at our best actually reduces as well. So it's about trying to perhaps find a way to balance all those aspects. One of the things that I've learned and I'm trying to do really is looking at some of the spiritual practices that we know, as Christians, that perhaps is practiced less these days, in terms of, say, observing the Sabbath, having a rest time in the week that's a regular time where we tune out from a number of things to allow not just for us to rest, both physically, mentally, and spiritually, but also to have a period of time in a day that's part of our day, week-to-week routine, to know that God loves us even though we don't produce anything on that day. And that has a very strong grounding effect on our identity and our ability to navigate all the other challenges that we have throughout the week as well. That's one of many spiritual practices that I've learned and I'm trying to kind of incorporate in my life. It is challenging. Especially, you've got a number of deadlines and different things. So I think as much as it's about kind of the amount of the screen time and how much we're connected and how it impacts on the health. The other aspect of it is trying to find other ways to prioritize or be intentional about spaces in our life that then help us to manage those challenges a little bit better.
So those examples were quite physical, all right? Body positioning and posturing. Is there another layer, right, of, what's the long-term effects of looking at somebody's highlight reel and you can't not compare. You can't not start to, and then the default of that for some people could be, I'm not enough, I don't measure up, I need to work harder and burn my family to be able, in terms of mental health, surely that can't be healthy. Can you, because that's not really like posture, that's just literally over time. You mentioned identity. Do you see that what you consume will shape your identity over time, maybe over weeks or maybe months or maybe years, and that having a massive detrimental effect to people's mindset and mentality?
Yeah, absolutely. We know the impact of social media on body image issues and identity and some of those things. I think one of the challenges, I guess, with a material that we read online or see online is that it's very explicit information. So, it's images, it's words, the kind of, it's unfortunately, it's just one aspect of information. What is missing, I think, from that is being able to have context. When you watch a reel or read a post, we have that snap of that moment, but actually not a lot of other context around it, which then perhaps balances our worldview or ideas around different things. The other part of communication that happens online in that kind of both written and visual material is that there's not an opportunity for us to use our imagination. And I think the core of it is not this. I think obviously too much stimulation is one aspect, but I think the core of the challenges in social media and being connected and being online all the time really is it displaces spaces in our mind and our thought and in our day-to-day life where imagination is allowed to take place. And when imagination comes in two different layers, I think one where there is imagination to be creative, to come up with new ideas, different ideas, rather than to just expand on the same or repeat the same ideas that you've read or watched. So I think imagination at that level. But the other part of communication is our ability to think and contemplate and imagine about another person's mindset. So as we're talking, and obviously we're having a conversation with a exchange of words and social visual cues, part of what goes on is I'm thinking in my mind about what's going on in my mind as I hear Wes speak, and similarly I wonder what's on Wes's mind when you ask me these questions in terms of your context. So that's what we call in my field of work, mentalization. So kind of our ability to kind of imagine the mind of another person with reference to ourselves in terms of how we are thinking about what's going on in our own mind. That's a very important part of communication that happens in a lot of in-person communication, in quality time, in relationships. And that aspect's actually missing with online communication. So I think, so as much as it is about the stimulation, I think it's also the loss of imagination that's the core of the difficulty and problem.
I think that's so good. Because, I guess I started out by going, okay, well, how do we view something and take inspiration without comparison, right? So, because it's nice to consume things and check out what people are doing, and but what you're saying is we need the balanced context behind it, which we normally have in general conversation, but we miss when we just consume. So when we're just scrolling, we're not consciously thinking about, okay, well, what's going on in this person's life to be able to do this, which we would naturally do. We're just almost switching off and just going bang, 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 and just gorging ourselves on consumption with no context, which is...
Yeah, absolutely. And with so much consumption without the imagination, then we're left with this an empty space. And the natural response to that with the consumption mindset is to fill the empty space with more stimulation. So more posts, more emails, more images. And that's also kind of what leads people to put a lot of material up there that then affects themselves and others. And it's almost like a kind of like a response to kind of fill up the sense of emptiness that may come from excess information and stimulation in the absence of ability to imagine, to contemplate, to think, and to reflect, which are all important parts of our being and shaping our identity as people.
I love this so much, right? Because I tell you what, and you've probably seen this from your friends on social media. Like somebody puts a post up and says, I'm going off Facebook for 30 days for a detox. So I'm like, so you really only have two speeds. You have, I'm all in gorging myself and I can't control myself, so I'm going to completely disconnect from the world, right? I'm like, surely there's a healthy middle ground. Surely we can work out, and by the way, there's probably a place for completely removing temptation, probably. We would do that with alcohol, substance abuse and things like that, so that's smart. But I'm like, then I see those people, they do it once a year. They're like, right, and now I've had enough. Well, I'm like, well, maybe we need to have a conversation around how do we healthily consume social media without it, having all the knock-on negative effects that it has through comparison and things like that. And I really like how practical you said. It's like actually just slowing it down a little bit and adding some context to, instead of just smashing through as many reels as you can get to, right? Just slowing it down a little bit and thinking it through. And then by default, you're turning your own imagination back on, which means you're not just gorging yourself on stimulus. So I reckon there's a lot to be, I guess pursued in that kind of middle ground of making it sustainable so that it's still valuable and entertainment, but it's not detrimental over time.
And maybe one of the solutions to have phones with a shorter battery life. I was having dinner with a friend and he was on his phone the entire time until his phone died and he started talking to me. It's and some of this is also kind of in terms of, as we innovate, we have more sophisticated phones that just last forever. And that sort of takes away some of the natural things that kind of interrupt some of these processes. We would go to places where there's no Wi-Fi no 4G, 5G or whatever, and then you have to kind of talk to someone next to you. But now we're extending Wi-Fi everywhere. And I've been to places where people say, Wi-Fi is a human right and you need to have it in public places. And so I think the natural, due to the limitations of technology, there were natural interruptions to some of the problems that we have today with connectivity. But as technology develops and grows even further, we have to be then more intentional ourselves in self-managing some of these things. And it's really hard to prescribe exactly how many hours somebody is able to go online. It's a little bit like, people who have kind of given advice that children need to sleep X number of hours or can only use technology for X number of hours. We're all so different. So part of that is really having the conversation, thinking about that, knowing our limits, and perhaps a starting point is to do as what you said, and the person who kind of has that once a year fast, knowing that that's their limit, but also not stopping there, then kind of thinking, okay, what do I need to do before that so that I don't kind of burn out, and what things can I put in place in my day-to-day routine and week-to-week routine. And it's going to be so different from person to person, because the last thing you want is to introduce a set of rules that in a busy person's life, when you introduce a set of rules without context, those rules that are intended to help actually create more stress as well. So, I have actually a lot of children and young people and families that come to see me because they've been told to do X, Y, and Z to solve their problems, and it's created more problems in their life. So I'm just coming from that context about understanding that all of us are so different, and we need to find different ways that we might manage that, could be similar or different to what other people might do.
Hey, are you enjoying this episode? It would mean the world to me if you would subscribe, like, comment, and share. It helps build the algorithm so that we can get this message out to more people. See, here's the thing. We don't have these fancy sponsors. It's me paying the bills to get this show to you. So do me a favor in return, would you? Subscribe, like, comment, and share. Let's get back to the show. You mentioned identity before, and so I kind of want to explore that, and I want to look at how does psychiatry and the Christian faith intersect. And I don't know if this is your phrase. I think I heard it from you, but you can't just pray it away, right? And I think within the church, we kind of just have these very quick answers for things, right? It's all about God and it's all about Jesus, which is wonderful, and we would all agree. And then there's the shame of like, well, if I'm filled with the Holy Ghost and I'm suffering with something that I can't put words to, I can't tell anybody because, for whatever reason, it's shameful. Like, we're supposed to have it all together, and sometimes our pastors are not busy enough to maybe give us the time to be able to process anything over. So there's all of that, right? So I guess, our identity is always going to get better the more time we spend with God, like more godly. But where does medicine play a role? Because, and I've been guilty of this in years gone by. I've kind of gone, well, before you ever take medicine, you'd start with the Bible, and and I don't know, maybe I'm wildly out because it's becoming a bigger thing. So, can you talk into what role does our faith play and praying and seeking a supernatural healing versus actually medicating on an issue to get a handle on it? Because I mean, surely this is where you're spending your days. So how do you intersect the fact that we need to include God in this, but also we may need to include medicine?
Absolutely. And I think what I've kind of found helpful really is to not have to somehow pick sides. The way I approach this really is that everything good in this world is created by God. So whether it's medicine or other practical things in business or in family life that helps us to deal with day-to-day issues, although it's not necessarily produced by the church or in a Christian setting, God's DNA is in all creation. So everything that is good in this world is from God. It's only the misuse of those things that He's made that is a problem. So I see that, medications can be very helpful in a person's journey, in their recovery in mental health. And the reason behind it is that just because the priest or pastor didn't create or develop the medicine, it doesn't mean it's not from God. So that's one theological idea that I think that's helpful for a lot of people that I've met in the education sessions that I provide. The other thing, I guess, is that I take a journey back to what we know from Genesis when Adam and Eve first sinned and realized that they were naked. They covered themselves in fig leaves. The fig leaves, to me, represent a lot of all the things that we have in our day-to-day, whether it's our possessions, our wealth, our reputation, our relationships, the things around us that help to cover our sense of nakedness and shame. And through the ups and downs of life, those fig leaves fall as a result of loss and change and transition. And when those fig leaves fall, we can have times where we're exposed to a sense of guilt and shame and feel quite overwhelmed with emotions and feelings. And that's my way of incorporating spirituality and mental health. What is an unhelpful message, I think, that has come through the history of the church is to make assumptions and spiritual interpretations of individual people's experiences without strong biblical foundations. So seeing a particularly unusual behavior for somebody who might be struggling with a mental health issue and making judgments that somehow they have sinned or that their family have been cursed or they need exorcism. So that's been some of the unhelpful messages that have come through the history of the church. But I think over time, with better understanding, with improved education, more conversations, more people speaking out, that narrative is changing. And I think the biggest impact of what's helped to change that in the church really is pastors and leaders speaking out about their own mental health experiences, being that role model and the power of their lived experience story that changes the dynamics in terms of some of the issues about stigma. So I've just mentioned a lot of different things in a short period of time, but really it's a combination of kind of having a good theological foundation in terms of how we understand suffering, how we understand the world that we live in, how we understand what God's intended for us and what His kingdom looks like here, but also understanding the history and the journey that we've been through as a church, as an institution as well, and then thinking about how we can perhaps be helpful to the people that we're trying to reach through a better understanding in terms of medicine, psychiatry, mental health, and those aspects of trying to hold some of those ideas together, rather than necessarily seeing that it has to be spiritual or physical. It has to be in or outside the church. And so I think what's helped me is really having that idea that really God created the world, and his DNA is across all of creation.
Love it. All right, so Danny, there would be people that are listening right now, driving in a car, running on a treadmill, just chilling out, whatever, doing some work, who literally are listening to this conversation and they're going, I'm not okay. Like, I know that I'm carrying a huge amount of anxiety, or even I'm having panic attacks, or I'm having some really unhealthy thoughts, and I don't know what to do about this, and I've been carrying this burden for years. What would you say would be some real practical first steps for them to take now if they're feeling that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first step is actually reaching out to someone to have a conversation. It could be someone that you trust, a family member, your pastor, connect group leader, your friend, your colleague, and actually kind of reach out and speak out. And there's no perfect way of doing that. Sometimes just saying, I need help, or be able to reach out in that sense. There are also useful resources like Lifeline that you can call and kind of initiate that conversation. There are also supports through your GP and through getting a mental health care plan that can help you address some specific mental health difficulties. But I think the first step to any of those situations is to kind of start a conversation with anyone, and someone that you trust, and not necessarily trying to find the perfect way to express those experiences before you try and work out what that is. And the question I often get in this space really is, do I need it? How do I know if I need help? And so similarly, if I had a lump in my face and I don't know what it is, I wouldn't just go, I wouldn't just sit on it. I'll go and seek advice. And it may not be anything sinister. It might just be something mild, but you would still go and check it out. So I think if you've got questions or doubts, or something has come up, it's important to reach out through a number of different resources, whether it's informal help through connections in your life and relationships in your life, the confidential helplines through your GP. So there are a number of different ways that we can also reach out, but often you don't necessarily need to be sure that you've got a problem to be able, before you actually speak out and get help, and be able to and you'd be surprised that when you speak out, the number of people around you that actually have similar experiences and haven't spoken up as well. And sometimes by speaking out for yourself, you're actually helping someone else too, by normalizing that process and taking away that stigma and fear from being able to express some of those challenges in our life and getting help for those.
Yeah, because if we had a physical health issue and we went and sought help, and then we found out there's actually nothing wrong, we would be really happy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So it could very well be the case that you're like, I'm not sure, but I want to go process this with somebody. And what you're saying is, don't overthink it, just start.
Yeah.
You may realize that actually there's nothing wrong. Well, isn't that just a wonderful thing if you then process it and realize, no, we're all kind of good here, but we can make it something that it isn't. And I think one of the elements here is the spiritual element of the accuser of the brethren, right? And as long as we keep it in our own mind, the enemy's just there pounding you with lies and deceit and twisting your thoughts. I have found that the minute you talk about something, it's almost like all of that bound up energy from the devil that tries to take us out falls away. Because as long as it's just internal, it just becomes this massive minefield of conversation. And and the Bible says that he'll never stop, right? So just by sharing things, I have found that in the past, it's almost like the attack from the enemy falls away.
Absolutely. And this relating to what I said earlier around the fig leaves. When the fig leaves fall, we experience a sense of shame, and that's a common feeling that everyone feels when they're struggling with a private difficulty or challenge. And then when being able to speak that out and being able to put that out in the open takes away that kind of sense of shame and guilt, and we're able to truly be able to live out what Romans tells us, that really nothing can separate us from the love of God. So knowing that even though we're going through a difficult time or feeling bad about ourselves, those feelings in itself actually do not separate us from the love of God, and that takes away the power of the accuser. And being able to speak that out confirms that reality for us, but also be able to bring someone into our life that can speak to us and walk with us in that journey, because it's so important to stay connected. It's so important to have different perspectives. And if we just speak, if we kind of sit within our internal turmoil, it's like, you have a conversation with yourself, and you actually don't end up having a different perspective, and you get stuck within your own kind of thinking. So speak to someone. Sometimes yes, and sometimes you take a risk. Sometimes it's not going to be helpful 100% of the time. But if you keep trying, don't give up. Sometimes you might say something to the first person and it wasn't helpful, go and speak to someone else. Just don't give up. I just want to be real that sometimes when we speak up, it's not always going to be the first person you speak to isn't going to be the most understanding person necessarily. We hope that over time, more and more people will know how to respond. But if you encounter an experience where you shared with someone and it hasn't been helpful, go and speak to someone else, or work things out with someone that you trust. Don't give up. Just keep trying.
What I love so much about what we're talking about here, and what I love so much about you and what you're sharing, is that we're taking the extremes out of the equation and we're exploring the healthy middle ground. So rather than in or out, black or white, we're this whole conversation is about figuring things out in the middle, which I think makes it far more sustainable. I want to move to possessions and wealth, because I know that you've got some really strong wisdom around the traps, I guess, of that, and I guess the psychology that can be affected by that incessant pursuit of wealth and things like that, and how our identity can be matched up in our material possessions and things like that. So could you just talk into that? Like, what are some of your experiences that you've seen, and help us get a handle on how can we proactively pursue building a great business, building revenue, building profits, and not letting it own us and control us?
I guess I'm just relating that your question to my experience in my field of work, where I see a number of people that come and seek help during periods of mental health crises. And usually there's issues around sort of loss, whether it's loss of a job, a relationship, or financial struggles, stress and anxiety relating to the loss of those things that you've mentioned in terms of possessions, material, wealth, and so forth. And then what I experience or see is that different people respond to that similar losses differently. And my take on that is it really depends on how strongly tied up that material possession, or that the reputation issue, or relationship that you have, or your business, how strongly that's tied in with your identity. The more strongly it's tied to your identity, the greater the impact of that loss is going to be. And so it's really important for us to be able to understand and reflect on actually knowing who we are, who we belong to, where we've come from, and who we are without those things. So sometimes it's inevitable, I imagine, through the ups and downs of life, that we experience loss and challenges. It's similar in business. You build a business, you take risks. Sometimes things don't always work out, and we sort of see loss as periods of failure. But actually, it's in those periods of loss that we can actually use those times to really examine who we are without those things. Because it's very easy to say it when we are doing well, that, no, I've got a strong identity, I'm not tied up to my possessions, until it comes to crunch time when we're experiencing those actual challenges. I would say that obviously I'm not saying that we necessarily need those times to develop identity alone, but if we are going through those challenging times when we experience loss, it's important for us to not just kind of pray it away or wait for that period to just move on and lose the opportunity for that to be a forming part of working out who we are as people, because that's often a learning opportunity to know who we are without those things. How can I be secure in myself so that when I rebuild, whether it's your business or relationship or possessions or any aspect of your life, then we're clear about what those extra things are and the purpose that the purpose of those things in our life with respect to our identity, and then perhaps we're not so strongly tied up to those things in terms of who we are as people. So I think it's important for us to have a perspective of knowing what we have and what we're given, and being good stewards of that, being responsible in growing the resources that we've got, but also knowing that there are ups and downs in life, and our journey through life is not to avoid those downtimes. It's about how we face those downtimes. So often conversation that comes up in my field of work with regards to resilience is that resilience isn't about kind of avoiding problems in our life. Resilience is actually being able to approach the ups and downs with this sense of hope and optimism, knowing what the big picture is, but also seeking the opportunities in the down times, in the problem times, in the troubled times, in spite of how painful that might feel.
I think the rich young ruler was a wonderful example of somebody who had their identity was completely inside what they owned, and for those listening, of course, it's the story where it comes to Jesus. What have I got to do to inherit eternal life? Anyway, was give away, sell all your possessions and follow me. And he said, I can't do that. And he went away sad, is what Scripture says. And so he was prepared to do nearly everything, except we could work out where his identity was, right? It was in his wealth, and that's where his security came from. And we don't know what happened with that story from there, but I think the only antidote, this is how I've processed what you're saying. We have to learn to hold things loosely, right? And we can hold them loosely when we know who we are without those things, right? If we realize I'm a royal priesthood, I'm a holy nation, I am chosen, gifted, favored, sealed, right? Spending life in eternity, regardless of if my business does $1 this year or $1 million a minute, right? And I think obviously you're right. I only learned to put language to those things when it was really hard. When we're flying, right, it's easy to be on Instagram, hey, but I tell you what, like the GFC, like I remember, I started a coaching practice 8 months before the world fell apart. It's like, man, that'll get you to figure some things out, Obviously, COVID, that'll get you back on your knees to figure some things out, Most people are pretty aware that 1 year after I got married to my beautiful wife, we were on a very different page and looking to probably not stay together, but we got help. And through that period, I had to figure out who I was, and praise God, 3 beautiful children, stayed married and wonderful. But they're the periods of time that I worked out who I was in God and what mattered in life really. And so, yeah, I think it's wonderful that we can make it that practical, and start to, it's such a phenomenal foundation when you work out who you are and whose you are, and then everything can be added on top of that, right? And it's just a blessing at that point. Whereas if your identity is tied to things or status or pride or, then when they get taken away, which they inevitably will in this world, right, where things change every 5 seconds, then you don't crash and burn. So I think that's just a wonderful way of putting it. We have this last question that we ask everybody, Danny, and it goes like this: how is the kingdom of God advancing because of Dr. Danny's life?
Try not to stuff other people's lives up would be a good start. Look, I think I'm learning. I've learned so much really in the last few years from the pastors in the churches I've attended throughout, especially in the last few years, that kind of have spoken into my life, that has then allowed me to grow into this space, to be able to perhaps contribute and take my work skills outside the doors of my clinical work, and sort of bring together my professional skills and my church life in that sense. So I feel really privileged in terms of being able to speak into those spaces. I have really enjoyed the conversations and people I've met through the talks I've delivered in churches in terms of helping people to understand mental health issues better, helping to support and provide a bit of a framework around understanding mental health difficulties, providing the coaching and training in that aspect in terms of contributing to the discipleship in a different way. So I've really found that enjoyable, and I have a number of those projects lined up over the course of the year. So delivering those talks. So I feel like I am helping and contributing in that space, being a bit of a resource to some of the pastors and leaders that I've come in contact with, helping to clarify things. So I've been a bit of a resource person in that sense for a number of different ministry leaders in churches. But also, I think being able to take some of those experiences back into my workplace as well, in terms of, I think sometimes it's not necessarily easy, but it's so different sitting in this professional space, being quite separated from what is real life experiences of people. So the stories that I hear from pastors, leaders, or through the talks I delivered around the real life challenges that people are experiencing, helps me to have a different perspective about how I do my clinical work. Because sometimes, when someone comes and see me, they may not tell me the whole story, because they might feel judged, or they might feel afraid, or they may think, I won't be interested to hear about that. But I think having that connection in other spaces helps me to hold a different mindset and perspective about what my patients will be experiencing when they come and see me. That helps me to do my job better. So I think I'm trying to bring my two worlds together even closer.
Mm. And I think that's what I'm so, what blesses me so much in this conversation is you're at this wonderful nexus point where you're in the marketplace with probably some radical, ungodly conversations and thinking going on in there, and you get to take your faith into the marketplace, which is really good, because you can advocate for the things of God. But also you get to take what works in the marketplace practically and kind of help the church get some handles on some things. And you are this wonderful conduit, actually, to get the best of both worlds and I guess the two lots of smarts to work incredibly well and break down a bunch of barriers in the meantime. So it's wonderful that you get to play that role, and I'm super blessed to be able to have this conversation with you today, Danny. I just appreciate you, and it wouldn't be easy doing what you're doing on a daily basis. So just blessings on you as you go fight for those families and fight for those kids.
Thanks, Wes. It's so great to have a chat with you. I've learned so much from this conversation today.
So guys, as you've been listening to this, I hope it's been a blessing to you, and I hope that it'll have some handles on your business. We might just link up here a few URLs for you that if you're feeling this, just some of the generic places that you could reach out to. Some of the things that the doctor said, like Lifeline and things like that. We'll just put some URLs here and some phone numbers for you just so you can do that. But it doesn't have to be those guys. You can reach out to your pastor, your best friend, your person at church. Just go and grab 5 minutes and start the conversation. And I think if that's where you're at, you'll see that starts a wonderful journey for you guys. All right, we will be back next week with another episode. Between now and then, why don't you execute on what we covered today? Bless you.